Chapter 22. Darkness Full of Light. The needle pushed back and forth through Sabrina's skin, the filament trailing, gently pulling the jagged pieces of flesh together. The wound resembled a grotesque mouth. "Don't watch," Sprocket said, leaning over her, the headlamp strapped to his forehead shining in her eyes. He was quiet and intent as he performed the minor surgery. Sabrina ignored his order. She wasn't sure if it was the painkillers they had given her or the blows to her head, but a sense of dislocation from her body had taken over, allowing her to watch as Sprocket and Lindsey picked pebbles from her abrasions and poked holes through her skin with needles heated in candle flames. Lindsey, like Sprocket, was quiet as she worked, but there was a light in her eyes, something more than relief. It was beyond joy. It was something akin to rapture. Like so many others, she believed that they all indeed had witnessed a miracle. If they knew how much it hurt, they would realize there was nothing miraculous about it. Sprocket moved to closing the cut over her eye, each catch of thread on her skin sending stabs of pain down her face. With the sound of feet scuffling and men grunting, Grange, Denalice, and two others carried Bran in, squeezing around one another in the small, irregularly shaped chamber as they lowered him onto a cot. Bran was awake and alert, grumbling that their help was unnecessary. "Just need a splash of water, that's all," he insisted. "Away, runts!" Denalice's voice boomed. A wall of curious children stood in the hallway, staring at Sabrina. Their heads were protected from the chill of the cave by hoods. Tears in their garments had been repaired with packaging twine, or even cactus fibers. Their eyes were wide, but sunken in faces made slender by hunger. A tree branch stripped of bark had been set in the stone on either side of the entrance to act as a curtain rod. Denalice waved them away again and yanked the curtain closed. "Away, or you will end up in my cooking pot!" Sabrina could not move her head to see them, but the children's laughter reached her ears while Sprocket continued to work on her brow. It was such a welcome sound. She tried to form the words to remind Lindsey of when they were young, playing on the playground, climbing orange trees, skipping stones in the surf at the shore, but only mumbles came out. Sprocket made a soft shushing sound as Lindsey squeezed her hand. Sprocket's was a delicate touch, honed from working on precision machines and electronics. She was grateful for it now. The rush of the fight was fading, replaced by a fatigue so immense that it swallowed any sense of triumph. Sabrina could swear that the atoms of her body were merging with those of the cot. If she closed her eyes, she could even see the dance of electrons crisscrossing orbits while their nuclei rose and fell like soap bubbles on the wind. When Sprocket announced that he was finished, she felt startled. She had drifted off to sleep. A thumb peeled back her eyelid, and his headlamp blinded her. She squinted, but Sprocket's finger was firm. "I'm checking you for a concussion. Any dizziness?" "No." "Good. Sleep then." The light clicked off, followed by the sound of closing med kits, and he and Lindsey were gone, the curtain slipping closed behind them. Sabrina and Bran lay on cots on either side of the chamber. A blanket rested on top of her, keeping her warm against the chill of the cave and the cold packs they had placed on her right leg. She tried to recall the snippets of the conversation she had overheard while in and out of dozing. Denalice chasing children, Lindsey asking for more bandages and ointment, and humming softly as she spread a salve on Sabrina's wounds. That soft sound was Sabrina's favorite. She closed her eyes and did her best to fall into the memory of it. A passing voice in the hallway woke her. The steps were already receding as she shifted on the cot, her bruises, cuts, and abrasions causing her to twitch in pain, wrenching her from her relaxed stupor. The cot on the other side of the room creaked, and she realized Bran was still there. They were alone. "Bran?" she asked. She turned to her side to look at him, the movement causing new pain to flare throughout her body, further awakening her. Bran was cast in bright relief by a portable glow lamp on the floor, while the shadow of his own body loomed on the wall behind him like a specter. His shirt was unbuttoned, and he was still dusty from their days on patrol. His hair was freshly wet, and his cheeks glistened with water. A basin rested on the floor beside him. Dark red bruises shading to purple were forming on his neck. One of his boots had come untied, the laces dangling over the edge of the cot. She hesitated only a moment before realizing she did not feel a shred of self-consciousness. She thought it was the drugs, then recognized it as something more familiar. The fleeting intimacy that came after a bout. When dripping and sweating and covered with ice packs, she would lock eyes with an officer she had just beaten, and he would smile, ruefully. It was one of the only times she could feel on level with her male counterparts. The sensation would pass the moment another officer would enter. She would be ignored from then on. "Bran, you helped me. Even though I tried to kill you." He took a deep animal breath, his nostrils flaring, his big chest expanding, then deflating. The cot creaked again as he turned to face her, its mesh straining beneath the weight of his body. The pink glow bars of the lamp reflected in his eyes. "You have it wrong. I helped you because you tried to kill me." He folded his hands over his chest, leaned back, and closed his eyes. In a few moments, he was asleep. Theopen entered a while later, moving aside the curtain with a great flourish, unfazed that he might be disturbing them. Sabrina realized she had also slept and had no idea how long it had been. Minutes? Hours? Grange, Sprocket, and Lindsey followed, but hung back by the entryway. Theopen was no longer before a crowd, but he still moved his hands in grand gestures, like a stage actor trying to connect with his audience. The immediacy of the induction ceremony over, Sabrina had more time to study him. Like many of the unfamiliar faces she had glanced in the past hour, his seemed strangely familiar. "Fortinbras is not a large city. I must have crossed paths with him before." She also could have just been confused from all the painkillers, so she shrugged off her thoughts and focused on Lindsey, who was speaking to her. "Theopen would like to show us something, if you have the strength." Lindsey was sitting down next to her. She had brought Sabrina a shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Of course I do," Sabrina said slowly, standing up and doing her best to ignore the sliver of pain that exploded from her feet and the way the room spun as she got up from the cot. She looked upon Bran, who was still resting comfortably, with some envy. "Excellent," Theopen said. The children had not been scared off by Denalis's threats. They formed a tight bunch outside the chamber, but parted slightly as Theopen stepped into their midst, touching their heads and complimenting one young girl on her beautiful eyes. He lifted her face so that the light from the dim lamp hanging overhead washed over her features. Sabrina could not help but notice the way all the children looked at him. Silently, expectantly. They began to close in around him, but he stopped them. Part ways. For us and our new sisters, Sabrina and Lindsey," he said. The walkways connecting the caverns were a mix of natural fissures and bored tunnels. As they passed chambers on their left and right, Sabrina could hear the mundane sounds of daily living. A broom sweeping a floor, a mother commanding her children, plates clattering, men laughing. Some of the passages were narrow enough for just one person to squeeze through. At other points, they opened up as wide as a roadway. Overhead lamps provided light, although in the narrower passages, the group moved mostly by feel. Here, the residents had an advantage over Sabrina and Lindsey, stepping over puddles, around obstacles, ducking low ceilings they had grown accustomed to. Theopen slowed for the newcomers, however, as he did for the gaggle of children following. The group passed rebels, wrapped in mismatched clothes to keep out the chill of the caves. Only the leaders wore robes like Theopen. The residents nodded, even bowed to Theopen and offered warm greetings to Sabrina and Lindsey, their new sisters. The group walked through the main hall again. The air was warmer and thick, with the smell of sweat, dust, and cooking oil. Only a few of the overhead lights remained on. The hall had been transformed in the time since the ceremony and the fight. The stage was dark and forgotten, the lights above rearranged to shine on a circle of women, each woman engaged in many tasks at once, whether it was nursing an infant in her lap, snapping beans, or talking with the others. Sabrina watched as one woman stood in the center of the circle and began to reenact the fight, imitating her movements, the bracelets on her arms jingling. The other women hooted and laughed. The tableau of women gathered in companionship, whether on a front porch or a cave, seemed eternal and unbroken. Sabrina wanted to remain, and repressed a wave of resentment as Theopen called for them to continue. From the main hall, the corridors led upwards. Theopen pointed out where the food was stored, as well as power cells. He stopped beside an empty tunnel, cocking his head slightly and raising his fingers to his lips for quiet so that Sabrina and Lindsey could hear the sound of rushing water. "We are blessed with abundance here," he said. "An underground river provides all the water we need." Lindsey made the appropriate noises of thanks and praise to the master while Sabrina pretended to be preoccupied with a young girl who had been following them and had just slipped on a wet stone. The rest of the way, the air became redolent with the scents of the outside world, tamarisk, sage, and sun-baked granite. The walkways grew steeper, opening into a larger chamber that swirled with warm air from the outside. This chamber was teeming with rebels, and adjacent caverns functioned as shops and markets. Children carried scraps of clothing to one chamber where piles of cloth sat waiting to be sewn into patchwork long-sleeve shirts, trousers, and blankets. From another chamber came the smell of the sodium bicarbonate women were using to clean clothes. In another cave, men bent over the eclectic mixes of recovered electronics, cracked cases, wild nests of wires, and flickering palm screens. All products came together in a market of sorts set up near the cave mouth, where booths wedged tightly against each other displayed colorful mixes of spices, vegetables, clothes, stone, and wood carvings. It felt familiar and comforting to Sabrina, even if conversation stilled as she and Lindsey passed. She did not see any guns until they reached the cave mouth. The guards were only boys, wearing oversized uniforms in different shades of desert khaki. Their rifles were old, with scratched and worn wooden stocks, but they clasped them close to their chests with white knuckles. They saluted Theopen with earnest, stiff movements, their eyes locked and staring out into the purple evening sky. "No signs of patrols, sir," one said. "And the last of the gathering groups are in." "I am pleased to hear that. Carry on, brothers," Theopen said softly, clasping the nearest boy on the shoulder as he passed, his sober expression matching theirs. The remaining children following them stopped at the cave mouth. The dry desert air felt thin and warm, even though a cool evening breeze was blowing down the valley, shaking curdy bushes and acacia trees, disturbing the skylarks that searched their branches for a final meal before nightfall. The cave mouth was halfway up a rocky hill. Below them, the slope was covered in aprons of scree. Above, the rock was steeper, displaying walls of folded strata that piled one atop another toward the starry sky. Theopen led them along a narrow path while Sabrina and Lindsey followed, bunched close together. "They are young," Lindsey said of the boy guards. "Too young," Sabrina said. The path proved less than well-traveled, and they moved slowly over jagged stones and around thorn trees with menacing thorns ready to rip flesh. Other rebels passed them on their way back to the cave mouth, no one following the same path as the other, their feet occasionally slipping on the loose stone. Each passing believer wore a contemplative expression and cast their eyes out to the west, where stars hung low over the building evening haze. They did not greet Sabrina or Lindsey. Theopen was taking a particular section of the hill face slowly when he slipped, pebbles skittering away beneath his sandals. He toppled, catching himself on a thorn tree. Lindsey gasped, but he smiled calmly, his hand wrapped around a thorn-covered branch as he steadied himself. "No need to worry, sister. It appears I missed the thorns. A small mercy from the master." "Let him be praised," Lindsey said, helping Theopen to his feet. "We are almost to our destination," he said. "I apologize for the route, but we must vary our paths, lest we wear a trail for the Elveds to see from the air." "Of course," Lindsey said. "Are you still feeling strong enough, Sister Sabrina?" Theopen asked, as she had seated herself on a stone, its warmth radiating through the seat of her clothes. "Yes," Sabrina said quickly. "I'm feeling better than I look." "Good," Theopen said and started again. He and Lindsey disappeared behind a large boulder, and Sabrina took a few more moments to catch her breath. In truth, her head had a vice tightening around it, and she was breathless from the waves of pain she felt with each step. But she would not leave Lindsey alone with Theopen for long. The thorn tree was just next to her. She reached for the same branch Theopin had clasped to help herself up, only to stop before she touched it. Thorns radiated from every inch, fresh blood dripping from their ends. So much for small mercies from the master. She caught up to Theopin and Lindsey at a deep fissure in the rock. They were removing their sandals before stepping onto the stone passageway. The gap was a crack in the mountain face, further narrowed by the boulders that had fallen and wedged themselves between the walls. It left barely enough space for a woman's shoulders to pass. Theopin had to turn sideways, the back of his robe rubbing against the stone. Sabrina removed her boots. The soil was fine and sandy. A cold draft breathed out of the darkness, heavy with the scent of earth, but with an additional smell that had not been present in the caves before. This smell was sweet and brought to the mind wildflowers, fresh tea, cinnamon, even muffins. She inhaled and savored it as she followed Lindsey, pressing herself against the limestone to see around her friend and watch Theopin. A light swam around the walls ahead and silhouetted his figure, his body black, his hands and face glowing with a faint gold sheen. The passage widened. In a chamber where they could stand abreast, Theopin stopped before a black curtain trimmed in shimmering gold embroidery. Veins of quartz ran at angles on either side of the rock opening. Sabrina sniffed the air again. The sweet smell was still strong, but now mixed with a chemical smell of polyepoxide, the epoxy used in construction sites. Theopin paused to look at them, a bit of theater Sabrina could have done without, before sweeping the curtain aside. They stepped into an amber dream. 1,000 tear-shaped flames flickered, cradled in sconces or balanced on tapered candlesticks, copious figures of melting wax gathering at their bases. It was more candles than Sabrina had ever seen, even in the evidence lockers after major raids. There were so many that the room was filled with a pleasant warmth. The light danced against the uneven walls, playing with shadows and glittering in globules of epoxy. The polyepoxide glue held a mosaic of stones against the wall. Fluted shafts, chiseled figures, misshapen cornices were stuck in with a confusing, scattered fashion. A few fragments had faces, a woman with blind eyes, a man with flowing hair, a snarling demon. One wall held darkened slivers of a colored window, like the one Sabrina had seen at the ruins that morning. High overhead, the flowing, flame-like script swirled across green marble, a broken frieze with the blocky characters running in relief below. Against the farthest wall were dozens of stands holding the outlawed symbols of the underground, the moon, the sun, and the sword. They were jumbled together in a crowded forest of polished wood and metal. The air was sharp with the fumes given off by the epoxy, but the scent was softened by the overwhelming odor of the candles, many of which were made from beeswax and smelled of honey. Honey. Like I put in my tea and on my muffin. The floor was covered in tasseled carpets, drippings and piles of wax scattered across them. Lindsey swirled in a circle of delight. Theopin looked on, smiling, the candles reflecting in the liquid gleam of his eyes, erasing the smudges of dirt on his robe from the tight passage.
"Sabrina, I've seen this place," Lindsey said. "I saw it in my visions. Darkness full of light. We were meant to come here."
She stepped close to the wall, running her fingertips across an assortment of mismatched stones.
"Theopin, is this what I think it is?"
"What pieces of holy places we can recover all reside in this room, until a time comes when they can be openly displayed again."
Sabrina was well aware that she did not want that time to come. Not ever. She had seen fragments like these before in the satchels and pockets of scrits. Such stones could be found in the soil on the numbered hills overlooking Fortinbras.
"You send the scrits," Sabrina said. "You send them for these pieces."
"Yes,"
Theopin said, turning to her slowly.
"Some of the children you saw earlier were born here. They do not know the ways of the cities, but when they come of age, they may make the pilgrimage to retrieve pieces of the holy places."
"What do you do to their memories?"
"We do nothing, my sister," Theopin said slowly. "It is what the city does to them. You or I could return, But those born on the outside, they end up, as you call them, scrits. Their memories are impaired until they return to outside the city limits. This is why their instructions are written on their bodies in the language of the holy ancients. If believers find them, they help them. But thanks to the efforts of the ministry, and people like yourself, they do not all make it back.
Jacob was from here. His family is here.
Sabrina swallowed hard and reached out for the wall. Do not be troubled, Sister Sabrina. There will be time later to speak of the wrongdoings of our dear leader Dagosta. Not to worry. You are now one of us, and shall not be held to account for his transgressions. Tonight should be a night of thanks. I will leave the two of you.
Thank you, Theopin,
Lindsey said, her expression one of swooning devotion that Sabrina found detestable even in her best friend. After he had left, Sabrina slid down the wall to the floor, her legs sore and stitches throbbing. She fought a wave of nausea bubbling up in her stomach. With her eyes closed, she pressed her feet into the cold sand of the floor and her back into the wall of the cave, willing the coldness into her aches and Jacob out of her mind.
Were one of those faces that seemed familiar Jacob's relatives?
Lindsey made a slow circuit of the room, examining every hollow intently, even stopping to make her own shadows against the wall. A crescent moon with cupped palms, a sword with her fingers, although the sun with its six-pointed rays seemed to frustrate her.
So many candles, Sabrina sighed. So illegal.
Lindsey cut her circuit short and crossed to Sabrina, reaching out her hand.
Come on. Sit on the carpets.
I'd rather not. Please. It's strange enough to be here.
Lindsey frowned.
I'm sorry. I didn't think of how this must seem to you, diving in so deep. There are people in town who only hear about this place. It's like a legend. It's so...
holy?
Sacred.
Because of all the candlelight?
I don't understand it. The shattered pieces. It's all a jumble. A ruin. Sadness. Each piece represents a journey of faith and love. Like ours.
Ours was a journey of survival.
On the surface.
Lindsey sat down cross-legged on the carpet.
But look at you and those 5 men. It is as if the Master does have a plan.
Please stop. It was 4 men. Bran helped me.
Moved by the Master.
Moved by a need to get in my pants.
Sabrina, Lindsey said, raising her voice. You know he is a better man than that. Sabrina did not like being scolded, especially when she knew Lindsey was right. She sighed, changing the subject. How do you know the words Grange translates are different from any other words? That they are holy?
You just know.
Not good enough. There is no reasoning in that. Aren't we beyond irrationality in this day and age?
Oh, no. Irrationality is part of it, Lindsey said, leaning forward, warming to the topic. To embrace, to recognize the mystery of it all. You have to first recognize all the reasons against it. Otherwise, it's not faith. You have to separate all that logic of your mind from the feeling in your heart.
I don't think the men in the ring today were embracing the mystery of the feelings in their hearts.
Lindsey sighed but recovered her enthusiasm quickly, as if the room granted her new energy.
Maybe you were sent here to teach us.
Lindsey, please.
She had hurt her. Lindsey turned away, staring at the carpets and tracing the lines of a design with her finger. Lindsey on the carpet, Sabrina on the cave floor, her toes full of dirt, the gulf as wide as ever.
I'm sorry, Lindsey. The words.
Tell me about the words.
What about them?
What makes them holy? I'll keep an open mind.
Lindsey shrugged and did not answer, leading Sabrina to fear that she had been too insensitive. Lindsey began to tug 3 of her locks absent-mindedly and twist them into a braid. She released them and said,
The best I can offer is that it's like a joke. You can read many words, put them in any combination, then one certain combination makes you laugh. Change any word and it won't work. And you can't point to it and say, this word works with that word, because it's never like that. You just take it in, and you either laugh or you don't. You hear the words, you're moved, or you are not.
She shook her head.
But it's not just the words. The holy is in actions, too. The way Grange and the others cared for Wills. The way Bran helped you. Even Dag raising...
She stopped, reading Sabrina's expression.
I'm sorry. Never mind. I did not mean to bring him up.
No, it's fine. Even I forget sometimes. It does not seem real. A week ago I was studying for my evals. The thought dredged up a swirl of emotion she was not ready to face. Had she forfeited school? There was no doubt she would miss her evals. Not that they mattered anymore, since she was a turncoat, a criminal. She focused on a shadow dancing over the flowing black script. She had lost so much, and that was more painful than the physical wounds inflicted on her that day. The sweet smell of wax was thick in the air.
Lindsey, has there been any more of what you saw?
A pink wall, a framed picture of a sailboat. Nothing else.
Nothing?
I have not seen a thing since the drugs wore off,
Lindsey said, flicking one of the bells in her braids. Sabrina bit her swollen lip, then winced from the pain, forgetting it was split. Lindsey gathered herself up, unfolded, and in a swift motion leaned down and kissed Sabrina on the forehead.
I hope you come to know him, through my love for you.
Sure,
was all Sabrina could manage. Lindsey whirled, facing the stands at the far end of the room, the dark, exaggerated shadows of moons, suns, and swords, hovering like threatening doppelgangers over the glittering originals.
Can I ask your permission for something?
Go ahead.
Would you mind if I pray?
Sabrina swallowed a lump in her throat. She had to wait until her lips stopped trembling. In a thick voice, she said,
I've never stopped you from anything. I'm not going to start now.
Lindsey thanked her, moving across the rugs in a slow procession towards the distant front of the room, where she kneeled, then touched the floor with her forehead before rising again to her knees, her hands clasped together. Sabrina watched as long as she could before her vision blurred. She closed her eyes, buried her face in her knees, and let her shawl absorb her hot tears.